Ellis Island is a federally owned island in New York Harbor, situated within the U.S. states of New Jersey and New York. Ellis Island was once the busiest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States. From 1892 to 1954, nearly 12 million immigrants arriving at the port of New York and New Jersey were processed there. It has been part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument since 1965 and is accessible to the public only by ferry. The north side of the island is a National Museum of Immigration, while the south side of the island, including the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital, is open to the public through guided tours. The name derives from Samuel Ellis, a Welshman who bought the island in 1774. In the 19th century, Ellis Island was the site of Fort Gibson and later became a naval magazine. The first inspection station opened in 1892 and was destroyed by fire in 1897. The second station opened in 1900 and housed facilities for medical quarantines and processing immigrants. After 1924, Ellis Island was used primarily as a detention center for migrants. During both World War I and World War II, its facilities were also used by the U.S. military to detain prisoners of war. After the immigration station's closure, the buildings languished for several years until they were partially reopened in 1976. The main building and adjacent structures were completely renovated into a museum in 1990. The 27.5-acre, 11.1 ha, island was expanded by land reclamation between the late 1890s and the 1930s and, at one point, consisted of 3 islands numbered 1, 2, and 3. Jurisdictional disputes between New Jersey and New York State persisted until the 1998 U.S. Supreme Court of New Jersey v. New York. The northern half of Ellis Island comprises the former Island 1 and includes the main building, several ancillary structures, and the Wall of Honor. The hospital structures on the island's southern half occupy the former sites of Islands 2 and 3, and there is a ferry building between Ellis Island's northern and southern halves. Historically, immigrants were subjected to medical and primary inspections, and they could be detained or deported. Now the island is commemorated through the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and it has received several federal, state, and municipal landmark designations. Ellis Island is in Upper New York Bay, east of Liberty State Park and north of Liberty Island. While most of the island is in Jersey City, New Jersey, a small section is an exclave of New York City. The island has a land area of 27.5 acres, 11.1 ha, much of which is from land reclamation. The natural island and contiguous areas comprise 4.68 acres, 1.89 ha, within New York, and are located on the northern portion of the present-day island. The artificial land is part of New Jersey. The island is owned and administered by the federal government of the United States since 1808 and operated by the National Park Service since 1965. Ellis Island, island in Upper New York Bay, formerly the United States Principal Immigration Reception Center. Often referred to as the Gateway to the New World, the island lies about 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, southwest of Manhattan Island, New York City, and about 1,300 feet, 400 meters, east of the New Jersey shore. Originally only 3 acres, 1.2 hectares, in area, it grew to 27 acres, 11 hectares, through extensive land reclamation projects. Much of the island's current area consists of landfill, and ships dumped ballast there for a time. The island was named for Manhattan merchant Samuel Ellis, who owned it in the 1770s. In 1808 the state of New York sold the island to the federal government, and it was used as a fort and a powder magazine. It served as the nation's major immigration station from 1892 to 1924, after which its role was reduced. During that period an estimated 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island, where they were processed by immigration authorities and obtained permission to enter the United States. A fire in 1897 razed the original wooden buildings, and all records were lost. The U.S. Treasury rebuilt the processing center in fireproof materials, and in 1900 the new main building was opened. Most first and second class passengers who sailed in were checked only briefly on board their ships and were allowed straight into the city, the assumption being that they had sufficient means to prevent them from becoming a public charge. It was primarily the third-class passengers who had medical and legal checks. The inspection process lasted 3 to 5 hours and took place in the Great Hall. After immigration reception was moved to New York City proper in 1943, Ellis Island continued to serve as a detention station for aliens and deportees until 1954 and was reopened to sightseers in 1976 by the National Park Service. The main building and other structures on the island were restored in the 1980s and opened in 1990 as the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. The jurisdiction of the island, which lies in New Jersey waters but traditionally has been considered a part of New York City, became the source of a long-running dispute between New Jersey and New York. An agreement between the two states in 1834 gave sovereignty of what was then a 3.3-acre, 1.3-hectare, island to New York. In 1998 the U.S. Supreme Court allowed New York to retain this area but awarded sovereignty of the remainder of the island composed of the landfill added after 1834 to New Jersey. Prior to 1890, individual states, rather than the federal government, regulated immigration into the United States. Castle Garden, now Castle Clinton, located in the Battery of Manhattan, served as the New York State Immigration Station from 1855 to 1890. Approximately 8 million immigrants passed through its doors, mostly from northern European countries. This constituted the first large wave of immigrants to settle and populate the U.S. In the 1800s, rising political instability, economic distress, and religious persecution plagued Europe, fueling the largest mass human migration in the history of the world. Around 1890, it became apparent that Castle Garden was ill-equipped and unprepared to handle the mass influx, leading the federal government to construct a new immigration station on Ellis Island. During construction, the barge office in the Battery was used for immigrant processing. The new structure on Ellis Island began receiving arriving immigrants on January 1, 1892. Annie Moore, a teenage girl from Ireland, accompanied by her two younger brothers, made history as the very first immigrant to be processed at Ellis Island. Over the next 62 years, more than 12 million immigrants would arrive in the United States via Ellis Island. Most immigrants entered the United States through New York Harbor, although there were other ports of entry in cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, and New Orleans. The great steamship companies like the White Star, Red Star, Cunard, and Hamburg America lines played a significant role in the history of Ellis Island and immigration as a whole. First and second class passengers arriving in New York Harbor were not required to undergo the inspection process at Ellis Island. Instead, these passengers received a cursory inspection aboard the ship, theory being that if a person could afford to purchase a first or second class ticket they were affluent and less likely to become a public charge in America due to medical or legal reasons. However, regardless of class, sick passengers or those with legal problems were sent to Ellis Island for further inspection. This scenario was far different for third-class passengers, commonly referred to as steerage. These immigrants traveled in crowded and often unsanitary conditions near the bottom of steamships, often spending up to 2 weeks seasick in their bunks during rough Atlantic Ocean crossings. After the steamship docked in the harbor, typically along the west coast of Manhattan, steerage passengers would board a ferry to Ellis Island for their detailed inspection. During the early morning hours of June 15, 1897, a fire on Ellis Island burned the immigration station completely to the ground. Although no lives were lost, federal and state immigration records dating back to 1855 burned, along with the pine buildings that failed to protect them. The U.S. Treasury quickly ordered the immigration facility be rebuilt, under one very important condition: all future structures built on Ellis Island had to be fireproof. On December 17, 1900, the new main building was opened and 2,251 immigrants were received that day. While ship manifests were burned for entries prior to June 1897, customs lists remain. These records were kept safe in the U.S. Customs Office. So while the Foundation's passenger search does not include ship manifests for years prior to 1897, customs lists for those passengers are available to view. Quite similar to a ship manifest, these records detail each passenger's name, age, country of origin, as well as how many pieces of luggage they carried. If an immigrant's papers were in order and they were in reasonably good health, the Ellis Island inspection process lasted 3 to 5 hours. The inspections took place in the registry room, Great Hall, where doctors would briefly scan every individual for obvious physical ailments. Doctors at Ellis Island soon became very adept at conducting these 6-second physicals. By 1916, it was said that a doctor could identify numerous medical conditions, ranging from anemia to trachoma, by simply glancing at a person. The ship's manifest log, initially filled out at the ship's port of departure, contained the immigrant's name and answers to 29 questions. This document was used by the legal inspectors at Ellis Island to cross-examine during the legal inspection. Contrary to popular belief, interpreters of all major languages were employed at Ellis Island, making the process efficient and ensuring that records were accurate. Despite the island's reputation as an island of tears, the vast majority of immigrants were treated courteously and respectfully, free to begin their new lives in America after only a few short hours on Ellis Island. Only 2% of the arriving immigrants were excluded from entry. The two main reasons for exclusion were a doctor diagnosing an immigrant with a contagious disease that could endanger the public health, or a legal inspector was concerned an immigrant would likely become a public charge or an illegal contract laborer. In the early 1900s, U.S. immigration officials mistakenly thought that the peak wave of immigration had passed. To their surprise, immigration was on the rise. In fact, 1907 marked the busiest year at Ellis Island with approximately 1.25 million immigrants processed. From the very beginning of the mass migration period that spanned 1880 to 1924, a relentless group of politicians and nativists demanded increased restrictions on immigration. A literary test, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Alien Contract Labor Law, Quota Laws, and the National Origins Act laws were among the regulations enacted to limit who could enter the U.S., with restrictions based upon the number of ethnic groups already living in the country. As a result, Ellis Island experienced a rapid decline in usage beginning in the early 1920s. After World War I, U.S. embassies were established in countries all over the world. The necessary paperwork and medical inspections were completed at the consulate, quickly replacing the Ellis Island inspection process. After 1924, the only passengers brought to Ellis Island were those who had problems with their paperwork, as well as war refugees and displaced persons needing assistance. Ellis Island remained for 3 more decades, serving a multitude of purposes, including a World War II detention center for enemy merchant seamen. In November of 1954, the last remaining detainee on Ellis Island, a Norwegian merchant seaman named Arne Petersen, was released and Ellis Island officially closed by the U.S. government. Much of the upper New York Bay's western shore consisted of large tidal flats with vast oyster beds, which were a major source of food for the Lenape. Ellis Island was one of 3 oyster islands, the other 2 being Liberty Island and the now subsumed Black Tom Island. In the late 19th century, the federal government began expanding the island by land reclamation to accommodate its immigration station, and the expansions continued until 1934. The fill may have been acquired from the ballast of ships, as well as material excavated from the first line of the New York City subway. It also may have come from the rail yards of the Lehigh Valley Railroad and the Central Railroad of New Jersey. It eventually obliterated the oyster beds, engulfed one of the oyster islands, and brought the shoreline much closer to the others. The current island is shaped like a C, with 2 land masses of equal size on the northeastern and southwestern sides, separated by what was formerly a ferry pier. It was originally 3 separate islands. The current north side, formerly called Island 1, contains the original island and the fill around it. The current south side was composed of Island 2, created in 1899, and Island 3, created in 1906. Two eastward-facing ferry docks separated the three numbered land masses. The fill was retained with a system of wood piles and cribbing, and later encased with more than 7,700 linear feet of concrete and granite sea wall. It was placed atop either wood piles, cribbing, or submerged bags of concrete. In the 1920s, the second ferry basin between Islands 2 and 3 was infilled to create the Great Lawn, forming the current south side of Ellis Island. As part of the project, a concrete and granite seawall was built to connect the tip of these land masses. The circumstances which led to an exclave of New York being located within New Jersey began in the colonial era, after the British takeover of New Netherland in 1664. A clause in the colonial land grant outlined the territory that the proprietors of New Jersey would receive as being westward of Long Island, and Manhattan's Island, and bounded on the east part by the main sea, and part by Hudson's River. As early as 1804, attempts were made to resolve the status of the state line. The government of New York City claimed the right to regulate trade on all waters. This was contested in Gibbons v. Ogden, which decided that the regulation of interstate commerce fell under the authority of the federal government, thus influencing competition in the newly developing steam ferry service in New York Harbor. In 1830, New Jersey planned to bring suit to clarify the border, but the case was never heard. 26. The matter was resolved with a compact between the states, ratified by U.S. Congress in 1834. This set the boundary line at the middle of the Hudson River and New York Harbor. However, New York was guaranteed exclusive jurisdiction of and over all the waters of Hudson River lying west of Manhattan and to the south of the mouth of Spuyten-Duyvil Creek, and of and over the lands covered by the said waters, to the low water mark on the New Jersey shore. This was later confirmed in other cases by the U.S. Supreme Court. New Jersey contended that the artificial portions of the island were part of New Jersey, since they were outside New York's border. In 1956, after the closure of the U.S. immigration station 2 years prior, the mayor of Jersey City Bernard J. Berry commandeered a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and led a contingent of New Jersey officials on an expedition to claim the island. Jurisdictional disputes re-emerged in the 1980s with the renovation of Ellis Island, and then again in the 1990s with the proposed redevelopment of the South Side. New Jersey sued in 1997. The lawsuit was escalated to the Supreme Court, which ruled in New Jersey v. New York. 523 U.S. 767, 1998, the border was redrawn using geographic information science data. It was decided that 22.80 acres, 9.23 ha, of the landfill area are territory of New Jersey, and that 4.68 acres, 1.89 ha, including the original island, are territory of New York. This caused some initial confusion, as some buildings straddled the interstate border. The ruling had no effect on the status of Liberty Island. Although the island remained under federal ownership after the lawsuit, New Jersey and New York agreed to share jurisdiction over the land itself. Neither state took any fiscal or physical responsibility for the maintenance, preservation, or improvement of any of the historic properties, and each state has jurisdiction over its respective land areas. Jersey City and New York City then gave separate tax lot numbers to their respective claims. Two ferry slips are located on the northern side of the basin that bisects Ellis Island. No charge is made for entrance to the Statue of Liberty National Monument, but there is a cost for the ferry service. A concession was granted in 2007 to Statue Cruises to operate the transportation and ticketing facilities, replacing Circle Line, which had operated the service since 1953. The ferries travel from Liberty State Park in Jersey City and the Battery in Lower Manhattan. The NPS also offers guided public tours of the South Side as part of the Hard Hat Tour. A bridge to Liberty State Park was built in 1986 for transporting materials and personnel during the island's late 1980s restoration. Originally slated to be torn down in 1992, it remained after construction was complete. It is not open to the public. The City of New York and the island's private ferry operator have opposed proposals to use it or replace it with a pedestrian bridge, and a 1995 proposal for a new pedestrian bridge to New Jersey was voted down in the United States House of Representatives. The bridge is not strong enough to be classified as a permanent bridge, and any action to convert it into a pedestrian passageway would require renovations. Thank you for watching this video.